They call it the land of freedom, a peaceful nation, a beacon of equality and justice. But dig beneath the maple leaves and politeness and you'll find graves, because Canada wasn't built on kindness, it was built on conquest. Long before there was a Canada, there were nations, hundreds of them. Nations with languages, governance, spirituality, science, and trade, from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the Anishinaabe, the Cree to the Dene, the Inuit to the Mi'kmaq. The land was never empty. But the settlers didn't come to learn. They came to take. They came with crosses and muskets, with treaties in one hand and lies in the other. They called it discovery. They called it civilization. But it was displacement, cultural destruction, and death. This is not the story told on Canada Day. It's not the one taught in schools or echoed in national anthems. But it is the truth. A truth written in the blood of the buffalo, the silence of forgotten languages, and the bones of children buried beneath residential schools. Canada was not born peacefully. It was carved from the land and the lives of its first peoples. In the next section, we'll step back in time to explore the powerful indigenous civilizations that thrived long before colonization, and dismantle the myth that Canada was ever a land waiting to be discovered. Long before the name Canada was ever spoken, this land was known as Turtle Island. It stretched from the Arctic to the Great Lakes, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and it was alive with knowledge, ceremony, and community. This wasn't an untamed wilderness. It was home to millions of indigenous people who lived in balance with the earth for over 10,000 years. Their civilizations were as diverse as the landscape. In the northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois, built one of the world's earliest participatory democracies. Their great law of peace would later inspire American and Canadian political structures, though rarely credited. To the west, the Salish, Haida, and Tlingit carved towering totem poles and navigated the Pacific in cedar canoes. Their societies thrived on rich marine ecosystems and practiced sustainable fishing long before the term existed. On the plains, the Blackfoot, Cree, and Assiniboine followed the buffalo herds, built mobile communities of teepees, and lived by complex seasonal cycles. Their governance systems, oral traditions, and spiritual philosophies were passed through generations with precision and reverence. Farther north, the Inuit mastered survival in one of the world's harshest climates. They developed innovative tools, built snow shelters, and traveled thousands of miles across ice and sea in kayaks and sleds. Each nation had its own language, legal systems, environmental stewardship practices, and spiritual beliefs, often centered around reciprocity with the land, not ownership of it. Where Europeans drew lines and built fences, indigenous peoples formed kinship networks across territories that honored the earth and each other. They farmed, traded, healed, and governed. They told stories older than pyramids. They buried their dead in sacred grounds and watched the stars for guidance. But when Europeans arrived, they didn't see civilization. They saw land to claim, resources to exploit, people to convert or erase. And they brought with them more than just greed. They brought disease, doctrine, and a hunger for empire. In the next section, we'll witness the arrival of French and British settlers and how the fur trade, religion, and military alliances paved the way for a violent colonial takeover. When the Europeans arrived on the eastern shores of Turtle Island in the 16th and 17th centuries, they did not come with armies. Not yet. They came with trinkets, muskets, crosses, and contracts. At first, they needed the indigenous peoples to survive and to profit. The French arrived first in large numbers, followed by the British. And with them came the fur trade, a booming economy driven by the demand for beaver pelts in Europe. But beaver wasn't the only thing being traded. The Europeans needed guides, translators, hunters, and allies. They turned to the Wendat, the Innu, the Algonquin, and other nations. At first, these exchanges seemed mutual. Goods were traded, marriages were arranged, relationships were forged. The French in particular leaned on indigenous diplomacy. Jesuits called it the middle ground. But it didn't last, because behind every gesture of friendship was the machinery of empire. The fur trade pulled indigenous nations into a brutal economic system that bred competition, conflict, and dependency. Once self-sufficient communities began to rely on European tools, weapons, and cloth. Wars between tribes were often manipulated or outright instigated by colonial powers seeking territorial advantage. Then came the missionaries. Jesuits and Anglican preachers fanned out across the land, armed with Bibles and a mission to save souls. They condemned traditional spirituality as demonic, sacred ceremonies were banned, languages were declared inferior. Conversion wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. While France and Britain fought for dominance in Europe, they used indigenous peoples as pawns in their proxy wars. The 7 Years' War in North America, known here as the French and Indian War, devastated communities who had no say in the global conflict, but bore its full weight. After Britain's victory in 1763, the balance shifted. The British imposed new systems of land ownership, bureaucracy, and military control. They began issuing land patents, documents that claimed entire territories with no regard for the people who already lived there. Indigenous nations, who had once been allies, were now seen as obstacles to be removed. The treaties that followed weren't peace agreements. They were tools of dispossession, written in English, filled with legal traps, and often signed under pressure or in bad faith. And as British settlers poured in, they brought smallpox and measles, wiping out communities already weakened by war and dislocation. Some villages lost 90% of their population in a matter of years. Canada's foundation wasn't peaceful negotiation. It was profit-driven expansion, built on fur, forged in betrayal, and sealed with blood. In the next section, we'll explore how these colonial powers used treaties, forced removals, and resource theft to strip indigenous nations of their lands, while claiming to do it in the name of law and civilization. They called them treaties, but in truth they were instruments of theft, written by settlers, misunderstood by the signers, and broken almost as soon as the ink dried. From the 1700s through the late 1800s, indigenous nations across what is now Canada were presented with formal documents by British and later Canadian officials. These treaties promised peace, protection, and shared use of land. In return, indigenous peoples agreed to coexist, or so they thought. Because the treaties were written in English using Western legal frameworks and presented through translators who often omitted or twisted key terms. Many indigenous leaders believed they were agreeing to share land, not surrender it. They had no concept of land as property to be bought and sold. To them, land was sacred, living, and communal. You could no more sell the sky than you could sell the earth. But to colonial officials, the treaties were about one thing: control. The numbered treaties, signed between 1871 and 1921, covered vast portions of what would become Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and parts of Ontario and British Columbia. These were not negotiations, they were pressure tactics. Indigenous leaders were often given no choice: sign or starve. By the time of these treaties, the buffalo were nearly extinct, slaughtered by settlers and the military to break indigenous food systems. With traditional economies devastated, communities were desperate for help. The government withheld food rations unless bans signed. Officials used starvation as a weapon. Even the meager promises made, schools, farming tools, reserve lands, healthcare, were routinely ignored or underfunded. Land sizes were reduced without consent. Entire clauses disappeared between oral promises and written text, and when indigenous peoples protested, they were met with indifference or force. The government passed laws that made it illegal for indigenous people to hire lawyers to fight land claims. Leaders were imprisoned for speaking out. Potlatch ceremonies were banned. Traditional governance systems were outlawed and replaced with colonial band councils under the Indian Act, a document that still exists today. Treaty rights were not respected. They were manipulated, hidden, erased. Settlers took the land, the government took the resources, and indigenous people were left with shrinking reserves, poisoned waters, and broken promises. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was policy. In the next section, we'll uncover how Canada's policies escalated into cultural genocide through the residential school system that tore children from their families, language, and identity. They said it was for education. They said it was for their own good. But behind the walls of Canada's residential schools was not learning. It was erasure. Beginning in the 1830s and operating well into the late 1990s, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken, forcibly, from their families and placed in church-run institutions across the country. They were separated from their parents, siblings, communities, sometimes by force, sometimes under the threat of prison. The goal wasn't to teach them math or science. The goal was to kill the Indian in the child. That was not a metaphor. It was a policy. The Canadian government and Christian churches worked hand in hand to assimilate Indigenous children into white society. That meant cutting their hair, changing their names, and banning their languages. Children were punished, beaten, starved, locked in dark rooms for speaking the only language they had ever known. They were told their culture was savage, their spirituality was evil, their identity was shameful. The abuse wasn't just emotional, it was physical. And too often, it was sexual. Survivors speak of priests and nuns who beat children until bones broke, who raped boys and girls in silence, who left them in unmarked graves when the trauma or tuberculosis took their lives. Thousands never made it home. Their parents never got answers. No funerals, no gravestones, just silence. Some children ran away. Many didn't survive. Those who did returned as strangers, disconnected from their roots, ashamed of who they were, and haunted by the ghosts of what they had endured. The trauma was generational. It didn't just scar the children. It fractured families, communities, and cultures. Languages that had survived for millennia came close to extinction. Sacred teachings were lost. Trust in institutions, in government, in faith, all shattered. And this isn't ancient history. The last residential school in Canada didn't close in 1890. It closed in 1996. The 60s scoop is officially over, and forced sterilization is no longer legal policy. But the trauma continues. In fact, some sources report that coercive child removals and discriminatory medical practices still exist today under different names, quietly, systemically. And just like before, most Canadians don't know about it. It may take another apology in another generation, just like the ones that came too late for the last. And for decades, Canada denied it all. It wasn't until 2008 that the government formally apologized, and even then it was words, not justice. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission began documenting the horror. But truth alone isn't enough. Many schools still haven't been excavated. Many churches still refuse to release their records. And many Canadians still don't know, or don't want to know, what happened. This wasn't a dark chapter. It was the foundation of a system designed to destroy Indigenous nations, not through war, but through their children. In the next section, we'll witness how Indigenous peoples rose from this trauma, organizing, resisting, and fighting back to reclaim their land, their voice, and their future. They tried to erase them, but the spirit of the First Peoples never died. From the ashes of trauma, Indigenous nations across Canada have risen, not just to survive, but to fight, to heal, and to reclaim what was stolen. Resistance has never been absent. It was there from the first broken treaty, the first child taken, the first mine drilled on sacred land. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, that resistance grew louder, more organized, and impossible to ignore. In 1990, the Oka crisis became a national flashpoint. When the town of Oka planned to expand a golf course onto a Mohawk burial ground, the Mohawk people of Kanesathe said no. They built barricades. They faced armed police. The standoff lasted 78 days, a modern reminder that the land was never given away, and it would not be taken quietly. In 1995, Dudley George, an unarmed Ojibwe man, was shot and killed by Ontario Provincial Police while protesting the theft of Ipperwash Provincial Park, land that had been taken decades earlier for military use and never returned. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a long-living tradition of resistance. In recent years, movements like Idle No More have swept the nation, led by Indigenous women, scholars, elders, and youth. They protest pipelines cutting through unceded territory. They demand justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. They challenge systemic racism in healthcare, policing, and education. Artists, filmmakers, and writers are reclaiming space, retelling history, and reviving ancestral knowledge. Indigenous languages once pushed to extinction are being taught in classrooms and spoken at kitchen tables. Land-based learning is reconnecting youth with ceremony, survival skills, and identity. And through it all, the call for sovereignty grows stronger. From the Mi'kmaq fishing rights battles in Nova Scotia to Wet'suwet'en resistance to pipelines in British Columbia, the message is clear. We are still here. This is still our land. Reconciliation is not a word, it's a process, and it begins with truth, but ends only with action. Yet for all the progress, systemic injustice remains. Indigenous communities still lack clean drinking water. Incarceration rates remain disproportionately high. Children are still being taken into foster care. Resistance is ongoing, but so is hope. In the final section, we'll confront the legacy of colonization that still shapes Canada today, and ask what justice, healing, and true reconciliation must look like if this country is ever to live up to its promises. Canada likes to see itself as a peacemaker, a model of democracy, a land of equality. But that image was built on a foundation of denial. The legacy of colonization is not locked in the past, it lives in the present. It's there in the hundreds of boil water advisories still active in Indigenous communities. It's there in the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in foster care, and the families torn apart not by policy on paper, but by systems still steeped in colonial logic. It's there in the RCMP, an institution born to control and displace Indigenous people, now tasked with enforcing state policy on the very land it once helped steal. It's in the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls whose cases are often ignored, dismissed, or left unsolved, part of what a national inquiry called a Canadian genocide. It's in the land, the pipelines pushed through unceded territory, the resources extracted without consent, the sacred sites bulldozed in the name of progress. Colonization didn't end, it evolved. And while Canada offers apologies, flies rainbow flags, and holds reconciliation events, the deeper reckoning is still pending. Because reconciliation isn't about comfort, it's about truth. It's about returning land, about honoring treaties, about dismantling systems built on exploitation, and listening when Indigenous people say what they need, not what settler governments are willing to give. Yes, there is progress. There are voices rising in classrooms, in parliament, in courts. There are language revitalization programs, truth commissions, and land-back movements. But for every step forward, the wounds remain open, until the foundation itself is rebuilt. This is not a call to guilt, it is a call to courage. Because healing a nation means facing the worst of its truths, not just with tears and apologies, but with accountability and action. Canada cannot move forward without Indigenous peoples, not as victims, but as partners, as leaders, as sovereign nations. The future of this country doesn't lie in forgetting the past. It lies in finally confronting it and refusing to look away. If this story moved you, share it, because silence has always been colonization's strongest weapon. And truth, loud, uncomfortable, unrelenting truth, is the only way to break its grip.